Can you hear me? All right. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the first of our Architecture School public lectures for the academic year. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker. Renn comes to us today from New York City, where he is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research and a contributing editor at City Journal, a quarterly that conservative African-American economist Thomas Sowell has called arguably America's best magazine, quote unquote, and author Tom Wolfe once described as, quote, the great fool killer in the arena of urban policy, end quote. Mr. Renn is a native of Laconia, Indiana, a town of 50 people, way, way, way south of us on the Ohio River, and has always been, in his own words, quote, fascinated by cities, end quote. From Laconia, he found his way to Indiana University, and from IU to Chicago, where he spent 15 years in the belly of the global economy beast with Accenture, a Fortune 500 firm headquartered in Chicago and now incorporated in Dublin, that consults internationally on matters of business and technology services and strategies. He eventually rose to become a partner at Accenture, but in his spare time created several software packages, and in 1998 launched one of the nation's first blogs, The Weekly Breakdown, on the subject of the Chicago Transit Authority. And then, on December 26, 2006, as if a surprise Feast of Stephen second day of Christmas present, Renn published at urbanophile.com the first post of what has since become one of the truly great blogs on all things urban. In my opinion, rivaled in scope and substance only by the very different urban blog of John Massengale. In that first blog post, Renn wrote arrestingly, "This blog is going to be something I've seen nowhere else. A spare no illusions look at aspiring cities, focused on the smaller cities of the Midwest and Indiana. Here you'll find my oft-times contrarian take on urban planning, economic development, transportation, what it means to be world-class, and how places measure up against that standard. But beyond that, you'll get unique data and analysis you won't find anywhere else," end quote. Exhibiting an admirable loyalist interest in the future of flyover country urbanism, and professing in his own words, quote, a mission to help America's cities thrive and find sustainable success in the 21st century, end quote. That first post 10 years ago was followed by a slow but steady stream of posts that eventually became a torrent, culminating today in Renn's position as an opinion-leading urban analyst, who, in addition to his blog and his duties at City Journal, also publishes regularly in Governing Magazine, The Guardian, and Forbes.com, is frequently cited in global media outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, The Economist, and the London Daily Telegraph, and perhaps apropos this afternoon, has even published in our near-to-home journal, Sacred Architecture. Renn possesses as comprehensive an interest in urbanism as any figure writing in the field, and has become one of America's most thoughtful analysts of contemporary city life. As an aside, nobody today writes as honestly and as well about the current state of and future prospects for Chicago, which is how I first discovered his work. Though his expertise is in urban economics and demographics, he has a holistic view of both cities and human flourishing, and recognizes that the former exist for the sake of the latter, which is also the basis of his interest in both architectural and urban form, and how architectural and urban form register and signify our existence in both nature and sacred order. It's a great pleasure to have Aaron speak at the School of Architecture. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you for that very warm and gracious introduction. It's been said that I love cities like only someone from a town of 29 people can. It's gone up to 50, so I put it at 50 just in case you pull the latest census, but it was 29 when I lived there. Yes, I am a writer about cities, and what I want to talk about today is an aspect of cities that doesn't get the kind of attention that it deserves. I'm not going to profess to have all the answers on it because I don't, but it's something I want to put on the table and encourage you to wrestle with and grapple with as you go out and launch your careers building the futures of the places we will live. And that topic is the idea of the sacred or the spiritual in the city. Lewis Mumford, in his landmark book, The City in History, had this to say, quote, "Behind the wall of the city, life rested on a common foundation set as deep as the universe itself. The city was nothing less than the home of a powerful god. The architectural and sculptural symbols that made this fact visible lifted the city far above the village or country town. To be a resident of the city was to have a place in man's true home, the great cosmos itself," unquote. And Joel Kotkin, in his book, The City of Global History, said, quote, "Without the notion of sacred space, it is doubtful cities could ever have developed anywhere in the world," quote. We live in an officially secular age, one in which the role of traditional religion in public life has dramatically declined from ages past in much of the world. Our advanced scientific and technological culture hasn't just undermined traditional religious narratives, it is also, in a sense, called into question the very existence of the metaphysical or the spiritual. The only statements that are held to have real significance today, the only truths, are statements about the material world. And this lack of religious sentiment is particularly noticeable among the intelligentsia. And in particular, a number of famous modern architects and artists, people like Le Corbusier and Oscar Niemeyer, were atheists. Urban and cultural commentator James Howard Kunstler, which some of you may know from his book, The Geography of Nowhere, went so far as to say this, quote, "Religion is a kind of low-grade showbiz for that half the nation under the median IQ," unquote. And I think that's a pretty common view among the intelligentsia. You see it embodied in things like Bill Maher's hilarious documentary, Religulous. Did anybody see Religulous? It's pretty hilarious. You can probably stream it. And in contrast to Mumford and Kotkin, who saw kind of the sacred or spiritual as a core function of what the city provided, here is what Le Corbusier had to say about the city in the Athens Charter. Quote, "Throughout history, specific circumstances have determined the characteristics of the city. Military defense, scientific discoveries, successive administrations, and the progressive development of communications and means of transportation by land, water, rail, and air routes," unquote. Now, this is a purely pragmatic view of the city. The spiritual element is completely absent in this discussion. And I think it's very notable that if you look at the Athens Charter or the U.S. Charter for New Urbanism, they talk about all kinds of things. They talk about housing, they talk about businesses, they talk about industrial facilities, parks and open space, schools, but they don't talk about churches or temples, nor do they talk about civic monuments or memorials. And it really, maybe apart from kind of public administration buildings, if you want to call it that. And if you think about it, it's really pretty amazing that we went from a world in which the church or cathedral was the central and most prominent building in virtually every community to one in which religious buildings and the religious life are basically completely absent from the urban design discussion. And this might make sense if religion had actually gone away, but the truth is it hasn't. Notice sociologist Peter Berger wrote an essay called The Desecularization of the World, talking about this and summarizing the latest sociological data. And he showed that in the world outside of Western Europe, at least, religion is actually expanding, not contracting. You may have read about the rise of Christianity in China, or the rise of both Christianity and Islam in Africa. But even in New York City, which you might think of as a sort of quintessentially secular capital, when an Argentinian evangelist named Luis Palau drew 60,000 people to an event in Central Park, the New York Times wrote an article in which they estimated that there were 1.6 million evangelical Christians in New York City. And that really surprised me to hear that. But most of them, it turns out, are in immigrant and ethnic communities, so they're basically invisible to the Manhattan elite. Of course, New York is probably better known for having a large Orthodox Jewish, very devoutly Jewish community. So even New York, which you think of as a secular capital of the world, actually has a lot of vibrant religious life in it. So those right there are two things I really haven't heard talked about at an architecture or design event. And that is this shift in which religious buildings went from a place of utter centrality in city design to one where they're basically absent. And the other is this kind of lack of attention paid to the social dimensions of devoutly religious communities in the city. The one example that has sort of emerged recently is some discussion of Islam, particularly with relationship to terrorism. But when I listen to the discussion about this, really, there's very little interest in Islam itself as a religion. Most of the discussion seems to be about the potential impact of Islam on preferred policies related to globalization. Yeah, I doubt very many, more than single-digit percentages of either those who want more or less Islamic immigration to the United States could even name the 5 pillars of Islam. They're really not that interested in Islam as a religion. So I wanted to note that exception, but the truth is I really don't want to talk too much about religion specifically. Instead, I want to focus more on this just broader idea of the sacred or the spiritual in cities, because this is something that I think we've really lost. And one way that we can see that we've lost it is in the loss of the idea of sacred space in buildings providing us with a sense of transcendence. And my dictionary defines transcendence as going beyond the limits of ordinary experience. And cities provided this sense of transcendence through sacred space and sacred buildings. And they do it in 3 principal ways. One, they can connect us to a larger reality, often spiritual or religious in nature. This is what Mumford was talking about when he talked about the temple linking the residents of the city to their true home, the great cosmos itself. And this might be the most obvious case that we can think about. 2, though, they can also serve as a locus or repository of the culture and traditions of a people. And a third thing that they can do is be a sort of temporal bridge that connects us today with the past and with the future. And the sacred does not have to be an explicitly religious building, though obviously it includes those. For example, consider the building in the center of this photograph. Does anybody know what that building is? Does anybody recognize that building? Does it look vaguely familiar at all as a kind of building? What do you think that is? Yes, sir.
Indianapolis, the World Memorial.
Yeah, that is the Indiana World War Memorial in Indianapolis. It was originally built as a memorial to Indiana's participation in and fallen soldiers and sailors in World War I. It looks familiar for a couple reasons. One is the use of neoclassicism, which you all will know something about. And the secondly is the form of the building itself, which was modeled on the mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Honoring the dead, particularly those who were fallen in war, is, of course, one of the core functions of sacred space in the city. This building symbolizes the values of the people in Indiana and the willingness and the necessity of its citizens to die to defend them yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So in that respect, it serves as both a cultural repository and a temporal bridge. What's more, note how, again, the use of neoclassicism in the template to the mausoleum. This architectural language locates Indianapolis and Indiana firmly within the 2,500-year history of Western civilization. It says that they are a link in a chain of peoples connected by blood and shared timeless values, extending backwards and forwards in time. Right, so this building gives this community a sort of sense of immortality in the way that the ancient Greeks achieved a certain immortality. This building is a symbol of the permanence of this community, its people and their values across the limits of time. The sacred can also be generated organically as places become the site of major events or repeated gatherings. They take on a heightened significance. And my example I like to use of this is Times Square in New York. In Times Square, every year at New Year's, untold numbers of people come, they pack into Times Square, and they watch that ball drop. That scene is broadcast on the networks to millions of homes all over the United States, which makes Times Square the de facto national New Year's Eve celebration for America. Times Square was also the location of one of the most famous photographs ever taken in American history. You've all seen that one, right? Taken at a spontaneous celebration of the victory of the Allies over Japan in World War II. And then, of course, Times Square is filled with all these massive, oversized digital billboards. And the billboarding of Times Square goes even back to the pre-digital era, a long time ago. And these are one of the iconic images of New York. Basically, everyone who comes to New York goes to Times Square. In fact, as someone who lives in New York, most of us try to avoid it like the plague. It's so crowded. You can barely move on the streets getting in and out. It's almost dangerous sometimes. But that's the draw that Times Square has, right? It has literally become part of American culture itself. This creation of transcendent buildings and spaces has suffered because of the loss of spiritual anchoring in the modern world. And I want to talk about how this has affected our architecture and our city building for the worse, using the example of Antoni Gaudi's Sagrada Familia Church in Barcelona. You're all familiar with this, right? You've heard of this, right? Well, it's basically an old school cathedral building project. It was started in 1882. It's still not finished. Even with modern fabrication and construction techniques, it's not projected to be finished until 2026, which would be the 100th anniversary of Gaudi's death when he was run over by a streetcar. And even despite his maybe untimely demise, I think he knew all along that this building was never going to be completed in his lifetime. The church was basically at best 25% of the way done when he died. Construction sort of ground to a halt, proceeded very, very slowly after that. There were a variety of factors. There was the Spanish Civil War that happened. And during the Spanish Civil War, a group of Catalonian anarchists set off a bomb that damaged the church and, more importantly, destroyed all of Gaudi's construction models, which were basically the architectural plans they were working off of. They also had a shortage of funds. This was an entirely donation-funded building project. In 1965, a group of leading global and Spanish modern architects and artists published an open letter or manifesto in La Vanguardia, which is the main newspaper in Barcelona. Le Corbusier signed it, Joan Miró, the famous modern artist who was based in Barcelona. They said that the church should not be completed at all, that it should be left as a sort of ruin as of the time of Gaudi's death. Or some people thought, yes, complete it, but let's hire a contemporary architect of our own time to design it in our own architectural language. Well, the public really didn't go for this, and the decision was ultimately made to complete the church according to Gaudi's plans, although there are some contemporary elements we'll see in a moment that were put in areas where Gaudi's instructions, there just weren't instructions, or we just didn't have any information from him on it. Oscar Tusquets Blanca, who was one of the people who had instigated that 1965 manifesto against completing the church, in 2011, he took a walking tour of the church after the interior had been completed and it was consecrated. And afterwards, he wrote about his experience in Domus magazine. And here's what he had to say about that, quote, "How could we have been so wrong? This wonder would not exist if people had listened to us 50 years ago. It would have remained a ruin, or it would have been finished by an in vogue architect of the time. How many people would be visiting it? I do not know whether it is the finest work of the last century, but it will certainly be the greatest religious building of the last three." And I have a few more pictures of it I can just show you. There is a picture of the interior. You can see the columns there were kind of designed to look like tree branches. There's the ceiling, which again, kind of a tree canopy / floral design. A little different view of it, capturing more colors. There's one of the walls with kind of the light streaming in. And you see the intricate ironwork, which was something Gaudi was kind of known for. And then I'll just end right here with this little picture of the church. I want to highlight three people who were involved in making Sagrada Familia what it was today and talk a little bit about their attitude towards religion. The first was Gaudi himself. Not only was Gaudi an architectural genius, he was also a devout Catholic. And he took his design inspiration from the natural world, or what he saw as God's superior creative handiwork in nature. The second is Joan Villagrau. He was the artist who created the stained glass windows for the church. He's a fairly prominent stained glass artist working in Barcelona. He's done a lot of churches and buildings there. And he said one time in an interview, quote, "A French reporter once asked me if I was a Christian or not. I said, yes, I could say yes, I am a Christian. And on the other hand, I can say I am not. It depends on what you think it means to be Christian. It is not important if the Sagrada Familia and the windows are Catholic or not," unquote. So I take it that his faith is at best ambiguous. If I were to put my interpretation on it, I would say he's saying I'm a cultural Christian, but I'm not really a man of faith personally. In any case, he said he was guided by his own personal artistic vision, although he took Gaudi's instructions into account. The third is Josep Maria Subirachs. He was a contemporary sculptor who designed the Passion facade of the church. And Subirachs died a couple of years ago, and he was a fairly militant atheist, although I believe he may have upgraded that to an agnostic later in life. Upgrade or downgrade, depending on your perspective, I guess. I don't think he invented this quote, but it was attributed to him that he once said, "God was one of man's greatest inventions." So these three, I think, represent a sort of spectrum of religiosity, from Gaudi on the one hand to Subirachs on the other. They also represent a spectrum of stances towards being under authority, which is something we'll come back to later. Gaudi's work we saw a little bit of already. Has anybody been to Sagrada Familia? How many of you have been? What did you think of it? Anybody? Good? I mean, yeah. It is a truly awe-inspiring work of art. I mean, I can't fully articulate how the way that building profoundly moves me. And millions and millions of visitors obviously agree. They've made multiple documentary films about it. It's probably the biggest tourist attraction in Barcelona. So let's take a look at the Villagrau windows and the Subirachs Passion facade. First, I'll give you a couple photos of the windows. This is just sort of a top view of it. Here's more of a close-up. And what you see, this is just an abstract color pattern. There's no figurative designs in these windows. It's just an abstract color pattern. You know, I don't know what you all think, but I like these. I think they've got a lot of beauty to them. I think he did a good job, but these really don't have the same transcendent quality about them of Gaudi's architecture. You'd have a tough sale to convince me this would be a tourist attraction in its own right if they weren't embedded in this building. And the other thing about this is because it's fairly new, it's in a contemporary aesthetic language, right? So it speaks to us, and we're primed, you know, to be used to seeing things like this and liking to seeing things like this. But I wonder if they're going to hold their allure a century or more from now, when aesthetics are radically different in the way that Gaudi's architecture has. And then there's Subirach's. His Passion facade has been highly controversial, to say the least. He only took the commission on the proviso that he was given complete artistic freedom to do whatever we want. And he openly boasted that his design, quote, had nothing to do with Gaudi, unquote. You know, he was actually one of the people who signed that 1965 manifesto against completing the church. How did the guy get the commission? I don't know. Anyway, I'll give you a couple photos. Again, this is the Passion facade. You can see Christ on the cross at the top. There's other various scenes in there. I'll give a close-up on the center panel. He said it had nothing to do with Gaudi, but those guys who look like imperial stormtroopers, those designs were from Gaudi's chimneys on La Pedrera. But this will give you a sense. It's obviously in a radically different style from Gaudi. It's been very polarizing. That Oscar Tusquets Blanca character who wrote that Domus article, and again was one of the co-instigators of the manifesto against completing the church, he called it pitiful. Personally, I find it a little cold and difficult to appreciate. But beyond that, it just seems to me that this is just obviously the work of a particular man in a particular place in a particular time. And therefore, you know, the future is going to see it as exactly that. The things I think, you know, myself and others would admire in this are things that we admire particularly because they are the work of this obviously talented and creative man, but not because they give us any sort of a transcendent experience of the world. And again, I think like the windows, you would have a hard time convincing me that these would be tourist attractions in their own right. And, you know, Villagrán and Subirach's aren't hacks. I mean, these are talented, respected artists, and they fall short, though, of the accomplishments of Gaudi. And, you know, Gaudi was a genius in that not only was he extremely creative and innovative in his work, not only did he have his own very personal, highly idiosyncratic style, and not only was he very much of his era in a lot of ways, but he went beyond that and designed Sagrada Familia in a recognizably Catholic way. Right? And this creates a legible building that not only that links it to the eternal, right? Not just the 2,000-year history of the Christian church, but also the grand story arc of creation from let there be light to eschaton. And because he used this Catholic style of design, the elements of that incline our mind towards transcendent things in a typically Catholic functional way. So the design, it literally draws our eyes upwards towards heaven. And we see things like the representations of the saints that stress the unity of Christians across time and space in the mystic union with Christ. And you know, it takes a transcendent point of view to even embark on a project that you know will not be completed until after you are dead, and which might not ever be completed at all. Conversely, someone like Subirach's, who's using a purely personal and contemporary style, he's going to produce something that's sundered from any connection to a greater reality, to the past or the future, to the people coming before us, coming behind us. It's limited to our present moment and our present experience only. So, you know, Villagrán too said he had to work with on his own personal vision and style. So it's hard to see how these men could offer us transcendence when they claim openly that they can't even transcend the limits of themselves. I have to work within just what I can do, just myself. And, really this isn't as much a criticism of them, I think. It is a criticism of ourselves and our modern society and the way that we just are. Today, society, if not the individual, really no longer believes in a God, except as maybe more than a vaguely pantheistic, nebulous higher power. We no longer have a teleological view of history, apart from maybe a belief in the progress of science. We don't feel the presence of one holy Catholic and apostolic church. We don't feel ourselves to be part of the communion of the saints. We have no reverence whatsoever for classical culture or civilization either. So that leaves us with basically nothing but ourselves. Right? We are left with ourselves. And this loss of spiritual reality limits us in very important ways. And Blanca illustrated this with regards to completing Sagrada Familia. Here's what he said about that, quote, "The main glory facade has yet to be built. Finding a contemporary artist anywhere in the world capable of taking on this task is the biggest challenge now faced. Figurative art is having a difficult time, that with a religious content even more so, and an art that can express the glory of the resurrection is now extinct," unquote. This extinction is important because part of what it means to be a human being, right, is to experience transcendence, to be part of or connected to something bigger than ourselves, to get a glimpse of something that is bigger than we could possibly understand. We all long for more than just the everyday mundane experience of life in this world. And just to illustrate this in a city building context, British architectural writer Will Wiles, who wrote in a way that criticized the fetishization of Jane Jacobs style, human scale, small scale urbanism, had this to say, quote, "The emphasis on little neighborhoods, the stoop, local shops, and walking distances. The human scale only tells part of the story of the city. After all, these things can be found in villages and small towns. All cities need sublimity, a touch of holy terror, a defiance of human scale that asserts connection to the greater urban whole. Elevated highways, crowds, tall buildings, interconnection and confusion, these things can be to some people dismaying and unpleasant, but the awe they strike is the overture of accepting the condition of living in the city. The tube roundel is vaguely holy to Londoners, intensely reassuring, because it is a sign of a connection with a vast system of complexity and importance. The religious meaning of the tube is a subject I keep meaning to write about at some point," unquote. He is, I think, getting at this concept of transcendence. And one of the underappreciated virtues of a megacity like London or New York is that they're so big, no one person could possibly comprehend them, right? So by living in New York, I am connected to something bigger than I can understand. And therefore, in a sense, I'm able to transcend the limits of myself by virtue of being connected to that huge city in which I live. We see this too in other aspects of our existence. For example, the way that we react to acts of exploration or attempting to do things that have never been done before. Does anybody remember this guy? Anybody see this? This is Felix Baumgartner. And a few years back, he set the world record for skydiving when he jumped out of that capsule attached to a balloon 125,000 feet up in the air at the edge of space, as we can see the curvature of the Earth there. He had to wear a spacesuit. He was so high up. And this was streamed live on video, and millions of people watched him do this. And I have never seen Twitter blow up like it was blowing up when this guy was doing his jump. And you see the Red Bull, of course, they had great marketing behind this. But there was something about this that just captured the imagination of people. It's the same way when the European Space Agency landed that probe on a comet, or when the NASA probe did that flyby of Pluto. We're getting this first kind of look at Pluto. We're fascinated by that stuff. And it's harder and harder to achieve acts of exploration like that anymore. I think that's one reason we've seen this huge influx of people into extreme sports, like Baumgartner, right? They are seeking after the same thing that drove people to the South Pole or to Mount Everest or up into space, right? They want to defy the limits of their own human existence. And as those who are going to be shaping the cities that we live in today and tomorrow, I think we need to reconnect to that idea of the spiritual dimension of the city and the need for a sort of sacred character to be imbued into our cities, our buildings, and our spaces that connects us to this greater reality about ourselves, right? We need to keep that in mind and create buildings, create spaces, create cities that speak to this longing for more in the human heart, right? Things that fill us with that sense of awe, of wonder, and even at times perhaps a bit of holy terror, and connect us again between the present and the past and the future to be part of a larger civilizational solidarity. Well, how do we do that? Well, in part, it goes beyond just considering the purely pragmatic, functional, programmatic, and aesthetic requirements of what we're doing to even consider the spiritual elements at all. When the Israelites were preparing to enter the land of Canaan after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Moses, who was going to die and not accompany them, imparted his last bits of wisdom before he went in a series of 3 speeches. And in one of his speeches, he told the Israelites about all of the material prosperity that awaited them in a land that did indeed, as promised, flow with milk and honey. But he also warned them and reminded them that man does not live by bread alone. And I think that's a hard thing for us as Americans to relate to, because Americans are intensely pragmatic people, right? Pragmatism is our indigenous school of philosophy. And I myself fall prey to this, being kind of a fiscally conservative guy. I'm like, man, we got to keep a tight grip on the purse strings of the city. We don't want to turn into Greece after all, which of course we don't. But sometimes not everything is a simple matter of ROI or monetary dollars and cents things. And I think there's another biblical passage I think is relevant to this. So while I'm on the theme, I'll read it. It's the story of the alabaster box, which is told in Matthew 26. And it says this, quote, "There came unto Jesus a woman having an alabaster box of very precious ointment, and poured it on his head as he sat at meat. But when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, 'Why did she waste this? For this ointment might have been sold for much and given to the poor.' When Jesus understood it, he said unto them, 'Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a good work upon me. For the poor you will always have with you, but me you have not always.'" Unquote. So I think sometimes you got to smash the alabaster box. And as Jesus himself sort of says, this is the exception, right? This is not the normal case. This is the exception case. But sometimes you got to make those exceptions. Now, if you do it wrong and you're a politician who's getting raked over the coals by the newspapers about this new boondoggle you just built, obviously that's a risky strategy, right? But if you do it and you get it right, the results can be magic. I think about, for example, the High Line in New York, which was an abandoned elevated freight line that was converted into a linear park. Here's a picture of that. It never looks like this because it's so crowded. 5 million people a year visit this. This was an example of sparing no expense to do it right. Again, the result is 5 million visitors per year, untold amounts of development, spin-off development, and tax revenue coming in. But beyond the kind of purely practical and pragmatic benefits like that, there's just the sense of wonder and delight that we get from city building at its finest. Again, this is a high-risk approach, but so is jumping out of a balloon at 125,000 feet. And then a second thing is our posture towards the past and the future. Traditional human cultures, from Catholicism to Confucianism, didn't just anchor us in a metaphysical reality, but also in the past. And in a sense, to a web of obligations that people did not choose to sign up to. Now, that is basically anathema to us today. In our post-Enlightenment world, we worship individual autonomy, self-determination, even self-creation, the way that people once worshiped Christ. You're not the boss of me. Has anybody ever heard that line? Not the boss. I think that was originally from a They Might Be Giants song or something like that. But it is a fitting slogan for our modern age. But we can lose track that limitations on us, in many cases, are liberating and protective. Architect Renzo Piano said this about it, quote, "When you work in a historical city center, instead of worrying about the lack of freedom, you should be grateful for the restrictions. Creativity doesn't need freedom, it needs rules. Then you can enjoy occasionally breaking those rules. I find myself in trouble building in an open space," unquote. And one of the important constraints that fuels creativity in city building is the constraint of our obligations to generations past. Not obligations that come as if someone else is making us do something, but obligations that come from that kind of transcendental solidarity we have with the past and the future, so that in a sense, right, we view them as ourselves, right? The same way that we view our actual parents or our actual children. By being true to them, we're being true to ourselves. And of course, we have the freedom to just say, we're not going to go for that, right? Nobody's making us do anything, but we do so at our peril. You know, I don't think it's any accident that it was Gaudí who saw himself as under the authority of God and Catholic tradition, who far excelled Subirachs, the sculptor who claimed complete freedom for himself. And it was also, in the same way, the atheistic Oscar Niemeyer who gave us the admired but largely unloved city of Brasilia. And it was Le Corbusier who, of course, famously had his conceptual plan for demolishing much of central Paris and replacing it with a series of modernist towers. These are the kinds of grand, extravagant gestures that are not linked to any greater spiritual reality, any greater truth, or to the past and the futures. These are purely personal or rationalistic visions that were created without the tempering of restraint. And it is precisely these modernistic and thoroughly secular visions that have been so often most damaging to our urban fabric. But it's not only things as overt as that. You know, we see it in the way that globalization has sort of homogenized the urban experience around the world, and the way that we have come to see that homogenization, right, is a good thing, to embrace it. Now, I actually think that there are parts of it that are good, and globalization was going to have something of a homogenizing effect. But the way that we've come to just embrace it, I think it has really happened without question, and only happened so rapidly because we lack any spiritual anchor in our own culture and our own past. I've always been struck, while every company tries its hardest to convince you of how much different and better it is than every other company in its industry, every city tries its hardest to convince you it's exactly the same as every other city that's conventionally considered cool. How do they market themselves, right? Well, we've got boutique hotels, great new boutique hotel just opened. We've got all these great farm-to-table restaurants. We have these best microbreweries. You know, we've got this artisanal coffee. We got the great startup scene. We got the great tech environment. We got all these things, right? It's the same everywhere. And it's the same everywhere. And, you know, do y'all ever read Wallpaper Magazine? Heard of Wallpaper Magazine? You know, they sell these little thin travel guides, which are supposed to be what the hip, cool person would want to see in all these cities around the world. I think they're really cool. I bought a bunch of them because when I go places, I like to have something like that as a companion to like the normal travel guide. But I've always been struck that basically they're all the same. The only real difference between them is the name on the spine. They're talking about the same sorts of things in every city. And magazines like Wallpaper and Monocle and different ones like that, they're not just reporting on things that are happening, they're helping to create it by their role in defining the norms of global urban success. And on architecture specifically, Renn had this to say, quote, if you look back 100 years, you find that there was still such a thing as Indian architecture, Thai architecture, Chinese architecture, African architecture, Dutch architecture, and Russian architecture. But now almost all of these languages have disappeared and are subsumed in a larger and seemingly universal style. The process has been like the disappearance of a spoken language. And of course, we are losing spoken languages at a fearsome rate too, something that does worry people. So in an era in which that homogenizing force of globalization is really powerfully acting on us, I think it's important that we retain and reaffirm that spiritual connection to the past and future of our cities and the deep cultural roots of a place. And we have to find a way to physically instantiate that in the design. How do we represent that in the design of our cities without turning it into retro kitsch, right, or pastiche? That's difficult to do, but you know, that's what Gaudi did when he built this transcendentally authentic Catholic basilica. But he also did it in his own very personal style and was very much of his era. So it can be done. And even Le Corbusier, I think, got it. I picked on him a couple times in here. So I want to read something where he got it right. And this is another section of his Athens charter that I quoted previously. Elsewhere, he says, quote, the spirit of the city has been formed over the years. The simplest buildings have taken on an eternal value insofar as they symbolize the collective soul. They are the armature of a tradition which, without meaning to limit the magnitude of future progress, conditions the formation of the individual, just as climate, geographical region, race, and custom do. Because it is a microcosmic motherland, the city admits of a considerable moral value to which it is indissolubly attached. Unquote. Now, I don't think his view of the collective soul is necessarily what I'm talking about here, but I like his idea of the city as a microcosmic motherland, seeing it in that way. And so I want to close with a vision of what's possible when we do embrace the city as a microcosmic motherland, and we do embrace the transcendental forces and the spiritual reality of our city, with a passage from British writer G.K. Chesterton. In this piece, he was writing about the London neighborhood of Pimlico, which at the time he wrote this in the early 20th century was an absolute slum. Today, it's probably gentrified, I would assume. Gentrified by now. But here's what he had to say. Let us suppose we are confronted by a desperate thing, say Pimlico. If we think about what is really best for Pimlico, we shall find that the thread of thought leads to the throne or the mystic and the arbitrary. It is not enough for a man to disapprove of Pimlico. In that case, he will either cut his throat or move to Chelsea. Nor certainly is it enough for a man to approve of Pimlico, for then it would remain Pimlico, which would be awful. The only way out of it seems to be for someone to love Pimlico, to love it with a transcendental tie and without any earthly reason. If there arose a man who loved Pimlico, then Pimlico would rise into ivory towers and golden pinnacles. Pimlico would attire herself as a woman does when she is loved, for decoration is not given to hide horrible things, but to decorate things already adorable. A mother does not give her child a blue bow because he is so ugly without it. A lover does not give a girl a necklace to hide her neck. If men loved Pimlico the way mothers love their children, arbitrarily, because it is theirs, Pimlico in a year or two might be fairer than Florence. Some readers, I think, will say that this is a mere fantasy. I would answer that this is the actual history of mankind. This, as a fact, is how cities did grow great. Go back to the darkest roots of civilization, and you will find them knotted around some sacred stone or encircling some sacred well. People first paid honor to a spot, and afterwards gained glory for it. Men did not love Rome because she was great. She was great because they had loved her. And Chesterton's irrational love of a place only comes from a transcendent connection into the larger reality of that place and its culture across time. That's the same connection, in their case, to the divine that motivated the medieval cathedral builders on their multi-generational projects. And I think what they show is the importance of buildings in instantiating or incarnating, if you will, that connection, that transcendent connection. And while the particularly religious has been neglected in city design, I think this just general idea of the sacred or the spiritual has as well. So I hope that as you all go forward and embark upon your careers and start building and shaping the world and the city we'll live in tomorrow, I hope that this is something you will think about, because I, for one, would like to see many more of our cities be made fairer than Florence. Thank you. So do we do questions?
Yeah,
All right.
you take questions?
Yes, I will. I'll let you tell us who to get them from.
Well, question.
Any questions?
Have you read A Winter's Tale?
You know, I haven't. I've heard it's very good, though. And I've been told that many times. I need to read that. It's on my list. Didn't they make a film out of that?
Yes, but it's a part of it. Best read it.
Okay. Always read the book first. Yes.
Do you have a favorite urban planner or city planner?
Yeah, that's kind of a hard one, you know, to think about, because one, I don't think that necessarily, you know, the plan is what makes the city. I do think there are elements of many things that come together. I do like Daniel Burnham and his ideas for Chicago. I like the ideas of Jane Jacobs, although she hated Daniel Burnham, basically. And she did. So I like them. You know, I think we can even learn from some of the, you know, the modernist manifestos. I think they're worth reading, you know, Ornament and Crime or whatever one they are, just to get a sense of what people are saying, because this is what I mean. Like, the human experience is so vast and complex. It's not, you know, reducible to simple words on a piece of paper or a simple plan. That we're always going to miss part of it. It's that kind of it's an organic thing. So I really, you know, I do like elements of Burnham, and I like elements of Jane Jacobs. And, you know, I liked Lewis Mumford's perspective on cities, even though, again, he and Jacobs didn't see eye to eye too. I just like to take the best of everybody and try to put it together. But a lot of it just comes down to seeing something that's working and just enjoying that. William H. White, who wrote the book, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, and his ideas were behind the renovation of Bryant Park and others, I think is another good talk about the small scale of urban planning, how to make public plazas work. Others? Yes, sir.
Just out of curiosity, Evan, in recalling your hometown down along the Ohio, is there a sense of a sacred space that continues to evolve as you see it?
You know, that's interesting. So I grew up 4 miles outside of a town called Laconia. And Laconia is basically a four-way stop. It's essentially a T intersection. And there were a few houses around, but I don't think there were really any, you know, much in the way. There may be a couple alley-like streets. And so on one corner was a general store, on another corner was the post office. There had previously been another general store on the other corner, and then like a restaurant that kind of went out of business. And then back behind the post office was the school. And I do think that a lot of these buildings really have come to represent, in a sense, the life of that community, particularly the school and the general store. One of the richest men in Indiana was a guy named Bill Cook. Was it Bill Cook? He was a medical device guy from Bloomington. He and his wife pumped massive amounts of money all over Indiana. They redid the hotel in West Baden Springs. They paid to redo that general store. And I think, you know, people just really have an attachment to that. Of course, they like that they can fill their gas tank. But I think that store and just being able to go to that place and see people there, that kind of small town life, those little institutions, the school, the store, play a huge role in the holding the idea of a town together. There's a little documentary that was made in 2013, I think, called Medora. And it was the story of the Medora basketball team. And it was sort of like the inverse Hoosiers. Medora, I think Medora High School had like 75 students in it, and they had gone 0-22 the previous season. And the current season, they were in really, really bad shape. And it was there, could they win a game? And they did end up winning a game, but it showed kind of the life of despair in this town. And the school district, it was one of these last remaining unconsolidated school districts. They were just facing a massive financial crisis, which we see. And yet the people of that town did not want their school to be consolidated. They didn't want a district consolidated. And I think they realized correctly, although it was an irrational decision, they couldn't afford a school. They knew that if the school closed, and that, if the school closed, that was the end of their town. Basically, the spiritual heart of their town would be destroyed. That had been the thing that drew everyone there, the basketball games, the gyms, the things like that. I think those little things are what really held small towns together. When those things were lost in a lot of places, like Laconia, it was originally a high school, the Laconia Aces. Then when they consolidated high school, it became a grade school. I attended there in grade 5th and 6th grade. And now it was closed. I don't know what it is today. But even where the schools have closed, people have tried to salvage the buildings just to have something of that memory there. That's what I would say. Yes, sir.
Aaron, fantastic lecture. And
Thank you.
The Pimlico quote is amazing. Who wrote that? Some famous dead guy.
That's from G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy, believe it or not. It's from Orthodoxy. So this is a book. This is his book, The Defending Christian Orthodoxy. It's really not a theological tract. It's many, many philosophical musings like that show how sort of, when you follow the threads, they kind of all lead back to traditional Orthodox Christianity.
So you've written about all kinds of things about cities, and if people haven't followed Aaron's work, he's very wide-ranging, as you can tell, but he writes. And he's always brilliant, he's always correct.
Thank you.
Even when he doesn't agree with me. Or with us. But no, I wanted to ask you, you've written a bit about some things relative to Protestant sacred space today.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you to jump into another field that I bet you know about. How much does our original founding and most of our history until maybe 100 years ago, the Protestant ethos of America, how much does that affect our urbanism, or did it affect our urbanism historically?
I don't really know how the Protestant ethos per se did, but as a recent article in Sacred Architecture magazine, which you should be subscribing to, had the way that the Church of St. Martin's in the Fields really influenced church design in America. How many churches are replicas of it? So I think there is a certain there was something that came from that. Where I think Tocqueville really nailed it on America when he contrasted the democratic social state of America with the aristocratic social state of France. And I really like because he was an aristocrat. And I think he realized that aristocracy was passing away. He probably thought that was a good thing. And yet he said, here's what we're going to lose with the passing of aristocracy. And one of them, he said, well, he said, in a democracy, in a democratic social state, maybe different from that, democratic state of mind, the average of humanity is higher. But the peaks are not as high as they were in the aristocratic. They're not the peaks aren't as high and the lows aren't as low. It's more of a mass market, if you will. And so a lot of what we think of as the great architecture of Europe, a lot of the great stuff that was there, I think a lot of it came from the aristocratic mindset of the time, whether that be the actual aristocracy, the kings, or in some cases, the church. So there was this idea, even the Catholic Church had this idea of things set apart for God, the special nature of its priesthood. And so this notion of a sacred building or something that would set apart and would have a higher function, a higher significance, a higher design, we'd spend more money on it. Now, I think we would look at some of these things and say, should they have spent that much money when you had peasants living in such abysmal conditions and were so badly treated? I think we forget about how bad life was for a lot of people and with no social mobility. But I think really the democratic social state, which leads towards, I think, an industrialization, mass production of things, has produced kind of blah designs in American cities. Now, as some writers like Charles Murray have been saying, there is kind of the development of an upper, a more of a self-conscious upper class or aristocracy in America these days, as this, top, maybe the top, I like to say the top 15 to 20%, probably top 15% of the country has been doing very, very well. The bottom 85%, not so well. And we've seen, what have we seen? We've seen a tremendous increase in quality in almost everything. Beer. In the 1980s, everybody drank Miller, Bud, and Coors. Today, one of the questions on Charles Murray's "Do You Live in a Bubble" quiz is, have you stocked your refrigerator with a mass market American beer in the last year? And when I was a college student, Shaver Light was my brand. So, but I think even college students today are drinking like high quality beer. And you can think about the food we've got, all these artisanal cheeses and everything. So for the people at the top, this kind of separation has in fact produced a lot of kind of aristocratic like increase in the quality of things. Of course, the average person stuck eating Doritos does not have life quite so well. So I think we're starting to see maybe the reemergence of some of that. And so we'll see what that plays in our city design. I think it's no accident, though, that those people have taken up the residents in the highest quality older districts of our city that do have this high quality traditional architecture.
So just a thought, it's not, just to add to reflection on Duncan's question about Protestant ethos. One of the things that I've been recently just becoming more appreciative of is the quality of American architecture and the American Renaissance, from about 1880 to 1930, and just that there really were few, if any, bad buildings during that time. But it's very interesting. I just offered as an observation that this was the peak, if you will, of a kind of muscular Protestantism. It was really a kind of de facto Protestant establishment that, and Burnham's a great case in point. Actually, Burnham himself, came from a Lutheran pietist sect. He was a Swedenborgian, but he just kind of, the people at that level just operated with a certain assurance, right, that they knew best, and they happened to also be very talented. And so this combination of wealth that the United States had at that time and skill, with, the Beaux-Arts tradition, the classical tradition, was still a living thing, and they'd all been educated in it. It really produced this phenomenal period of architecture in what was not a Roman Catholic, context. Of course, it was a tradition inherited, not from Roman Catholicism, but of which Roman Catholicism was a transmitter. And so I just offer that as an observation. The question that I have, and I don't have an explanation for that, but the question I have is that you write a lot and are sort of deeply conscious of things that are going on in the global economy. And you started your blog 10 years ago with this professed interest particularly in Midwestern cities that are not doing so well, even Indiana cities that are not doing so well. And this whole issue of the global economy, the way the global cities that sort of concentrate resources in one place and appear, now I don't know if this is actually true, but have the sense of, there's a general sense that they suck, the talent, right, out of flyover country. What's your take? We talked a little bit about this at lunch, but I just what's your take on the future of the global economy? What's your take on the future of localism? Because I know you're interested in localism and you're obviously knowledgeable about the global economy, and I just wonder if you would be willing to share some thoughts about that.
Yeah, well, this is a little bit speculative and outside of my area of detailed study. But when I look at the trends in the world today, I think the global economy has tended towards a winner take all. As there's been these forces, the flat world of Thomas Friedman, making it very difficult for people in that bottom 85% to earn a living through factory work or whatever they're doing. And that would even include now many white collar workers, whose jobs, IT, a lot of that's been sent overseas. In converse with the Richard Florida spiky world, as the elite level bankers and international business lawyers and international marketing gurus have doing better and better and better than ever. And so these tensions and pressures, in contrast, are starting to basically blow the thing up. We saw that with the Brexit vote. We see it with the rise of populist parties. Generally in Europe, we associate these populist parties with the political right. But there are some leftist populist parties. Podemos, I think in Spain, is one of these left-wing populist parties. We saw it in the U.S. First iteration was maybe the Tea Party. The second is kind of the Donald Trump candidacy. And right now, he's got a very good shot of winning. So I think ultimately, these pressures are sort of breaking. The status quo is not going to hold in its current form. Just like an industrial age, kind of the Gilded Age, this wealth and we basically did some things. It wasn't like we just got through that. We did some things. We had the antitrust laws came in. We broke up the trusts. We regulated the railroads. There were a lot of things that we did that sort of reined in the worst excesses of that and created a system. And then, ultimately mass production produced an economy where, produced this is another one of Murray's things. Do the workers, are they able to buy the product that they produce? The people who worked, the people who are a waitress at Outback Steakhouse can afford, on occasion, to eat at Outback. The people who are working in a car company could afford to buy a car. The person who is delivering luggage at the Four Seasons cannot afford to stay there necessarily. I think they may have that. Maybe some people in the hotel industry, there's like special deals they get. But I think that's the sense where, the luxury, there's between a luxury product and a mass product. So there had to be some different, and there was, massive amounts of violence, as you may recall. Anarchist movements. There was union organizing movements. There was a lot of anti-union violence. Many, many things went on in that era. And we eventually sort of came to some resolutions in the Great Depression, World War II. And now I think we're going to have some new solutions where I feel like the leadership, kind of the Davoisie, some to dismissively refer to them, have really kind of failed in a sense. And that the only thing they can say is double down on the current. We have to suppress these insurgencies and just keep doing more of what we're doing. Because we can't, The Economist magazine was one of they had an editorial where they basically said, the greatest threat to humanity is that this globalization would be rolled back in any way. They believe in it that much. And so I think it's tremendously under threat. I think that the pressures building in the globalization is going to produce a serious rupture. And so we're going to see something different emerge. What it is, I don't know yet. Always hazy is the future, they may say. But I think it's going to be a huge one. I do think, though, I want to go back to Duncan's question because it's really a powerful one. And I forgot the best book. The religious character of the founding of a city, of a place, has an immense shaping force on how that place goes. And there's a phenomenal book written by one of America's premier historians about this. It's Digby Balsall's Puritan Boston and Quaker Philadelphia. Balsall was the guy who popularized the term WASP. He wrote the book, The Philadelphia Gentleman. He was the foremost historian of the American elites and American upper class. He was at Penn. He was from Philadelphia. And this book is not kind to Philadelphia. This was not really a kind book. Philadelphia, it's sort of like, why did Boston become this elite hub And Philadelphia sort of became this working class, kind of fell into ruin, right, in a sense. And still to this day, of all the great East Coast metropolises, Philly is the one that is least revived. It's coming back. It's least revived. And so it was really, he came down to this idea of this leveling Quaker ethos versus this Calvinistic. The Puritans were Calvinists. They had this concept of the elect, and the people who were in charge were sort of entitled to rule. And that maybe goes back to your thing. There's they felt they had been anointed by God with the right to rule, but with a public service ethos, right? The Philadelphia elite had great parties. They were the premier grand upper class, but they were really not involved in civic affairs and science. Whereas in Boston, they were involved in running city government, public stewards. They were great money managers, which is why the finance industry was there. They were eminent in science and medicine and many other things because they felt like they had this sense of election on the one hand, but with that came a responsibility to use it and not just sit around and polishing your gold coins. So it's a little bit of a wonky book, but it's a really, really, really phenomenal and illuminating book. Puritan Boston and Quaker Philadelphia. Yes.
Yet it was New York that triumphed.
Yeah, well, I think that's it. I mean, there's I think it's the book is The Island at the City of the World, Center of the World. I haven't read it, but to this day, you would say that the Dutch trading culture of the original founding of New York had a huge and profound impact on its trade, or it was a very trade orientation. It was a very multiculturalist. It was a multiculturalist from the word go, very open-minded, very tolerant society. And so, in a sense, I think it was did Joel Garreau put New York in his own category and like the 9 nations of America? A lot of the ones that purport to have the different regions of America put New York as kind of its own kind of separate culture. New Netherlands, it's called, and it really has a unique, tremendously unique culture. And I think part of that came from the fact that it was settled by the Dutch. The people who found the place have a profoundly shaping influence on it that stays for a while. I mean, as there's immigrations and things change, they do, but something about the way things work there are founded on it. And so there is that kind of, this gets to the idea that there is a spirit of a place. Kind of the secret of New York is certainly not geographic advantage. It had a harbor in this, but it was an island. If you were looking strictly at geography, the place to have put New York City was Jersey City, right? Where you could at least get there by railroad. I mean, keep in mind, until Penn Station was built in the early 1900s, you could not even bring stuff, the railroads couldn't even get into Manhattan from the west. You had to take ferries to get across. So, putting stuff on an island was not necessarily convenient always, but there was something about the city. And I think that's what happened. Yes.
So in light of the importance of who founds the city for how it develops, what do you think about sort of the tech companies coming out and there's Sidewalk Labs and Alphabet that the theory is that eventually Google wants to create its own city from scratch. So what do you think would happen to a city that was created by a tech company? Like, how does the spirit of that?
Well, there's a couple of if it's Google or any of the major tech companies, it'd probably be a little Orwellian, I might say. But there actually are examples of this, and that is one is Songdo City outside of South Korea, which was basically a sort of a suburb built on reclaimed land from the ocean near Incheon. And it was built to be the smart city, the world's premier smart city from the ground up. So everything's fully automated. And the other one that wasn't built by a tech company, it's Masdar, which I think is somewhere in the middle. It was in the Middle East. I can't remember exactly which of these emirates it's in, but it's supposed to be the zero energy positive thing in the middle of the desert. Practically no one lives there. I think a lot of these hyper planned cities, you try to create the overly planned city, it tends to flop. And so I think the technology companies do tremendously great things. Right? Uber has revolutionized life in a lot of cities. In a place like Indianapolis now, where you could never get a cab before, the fact that you can take an Uber to have transportation when you go out to like a bar or a restaurant or something is a really amazing thing. So I really like what a lot of the tech companies do, but tech companies see the world as an engineering problem to be solved. They don't look at they're really not motivated by the human, this spiritual, I mean, that's something that doesn't compute, that doesn't compute for them, so to speak. And so I think that if I were to suggest the city of the future designed by that would be like something like the one in THX 1138. Very, 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 very efficient. A few people at the top kind of making the decisions and everybody else just pressing on their phone or, doing a thing. Yes, in the back there.
Can you go back to the Chesterfield quote for a second? I think there's a lot of truth in it, but it seems to me that it presents kind of a paradox for architects, which is how do architects go about designing in places that are not loved people? Is that place due to mediocrity, or is there kind of a reversal of the logic sometimes where we can sort of induce love in the end for a certain place?
Yeah, well, when you're an architect, generally speaking, you're the consultant, not the client. So that could create, that's always, I think, a challenge. I worked in consulting for many years. And, it takes two to tango in that. You need a great consultant, but you also need to have a great client. You can't do things if you don't have a great client. In Machiavelli's The Prince, he has a saying in which he says something along the lines of, wheresoever they originate, good counsels are always born of the wisdom of the prince, not the wisdom of the prince from good counsels. This is an axiom that has never failed. A prince that is not wise himself will never take good advice. And that is, I think that's the case a lot of places are in. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. I wrote a lot about Indianapolis, and I put them in that category. They simply don't want good architecture there. That's just reality. I would say that in an audience there, that they have illustrated that there's just something about it that they have a different kind of idea about what they want. And I think part of it is, though, here's where the architect, I think, can come in. When Indianapolis was designing its economic development strategy, I'm probably giving it too much of I'm probably saying it was more intentional than it really was at the time. But in the 70s, starting in the 70s, especially in the 80s, they said, let's do something around sports. They said, we're going to be the amateur sports capital of the world. And you know what? Hoosiers love sports. There's this history of Indiana basketball. There was the Indianapolis 500. When you told the people their sports, they're like, yeah, we can get behind this. Now, if you said we're going to be the vegan capital of the year, that might be a problem. So I think there's a sense of, when I go to places, I go to Ohio. If you go to all these places, the question is always, what's our identity? What's our identity? What's our identity? And a lot of places have trouble talking about their identity. And yet, when I go to Ohio, visit, what's the identity of Ohio? How would you describe the identity of Ohio? We can't really do it that easily, but go there, visit Cincinnati, Columbus, and Cleveland. And what you see right there is there are three radically different cities. You may not be able to put your finger on what makes them distinct, but it's like literally like a bucket of water in the face. I mean, you just that tangible how different those cities are. They're all good in their own way. And so I think as an architect, part of what I try to do as an urban writer is kind of go on a little bit of an anthropology or, an archaeology mission of a city to find out that real identity that is there. And if you could bring that out and surface it and create something that really resonates with that identity, I think it's more likely to be accepted. Because I think a lot of times we're bringing in what we think is a good design, but it's really a foreign design. And I actually think a lot of what this trend to hire some global Pritzker Prize winning architect to design some outre building in a place is what people want to do. I want to be architecturally significant, so we have to go hire Frank Gehry to design us a crazy thing. A lot of those are really great buildings, but a lot of them are kind of the same one in every city. It's the brand architect, it's not brand city. I think a lot of them come from a weak sense of civic confidence and civic identity that we have to be graced by the presence of some building that this architect design that doesn't even represent us, it represents him, right? We're trying to boost our brand by associating it with this other architect. So I think to the extent that we bring us to the table, as opposed to trying to bring not just the best of us, but the best of them, right? That's the kind of fusion I think Gaudí was able to achieve. Then I think it's more likely to be accepted by people than if it doesn't seem to have some connection to them. That's kind of how I thought about it.
So I'm going to say, if there's one more question, we can take one more question, and that'll be it. So, please.
I think building on that, I saw recently you wrote about what Peter Thiel said, kind of dismissing Chicago a little bit. What are the qualities that would make that a city, Chicago, a city great on its own? What's intrinsically great?
Well, I think Chicago is a great city. I mean, Chicago, one of the things that makes Chicago great is that unlike your average Midwest city, it has an extremely robust sense of itself as a city, its history. There have been so many books. You can go to like the local Barnes and Noble, while there still are Barnes and Nobles, and go to the local interest section. Look at the books that have been written about cities. Most cities don't have very many books that have been written about them. Chicago's got amazing books that have been written about them. So many books. And so I think there's been a lot of celebration of the character. It's a city that's got a very unique, distinct character to it. And so the question is, though, is Chicago a London or a New York kind of place, maybe even a Hong Kong? I think the answer is no, right? That's not its place in the world. And we have to, so part of it is we have to kind of know our place in the world and ultimately become confident in that. And, you know, since everybody here is very young and you're at a very prestigious institution, you know, the future is like a blank slate for you. And things are great, you know, and you can dream big dreams. And, you know, that's what I did. So then I was, you know, I started working for Accenture and I keep getting promoted and I keep getting promoted and I keep getting promoted. And then, you know, somewhere, usually it starts to happen in your mid-30s through your mid-40s. At some point, you know, your career starts to plateau a little bit for most people, right? The reality is most people are not going to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. You know, most of us are not going to end up in, you know, playing in the NFL or the NBA. We have to, you know, we start to come face to face with our own limits. And you start realizing, oh, wait a minute. There's the guy 5 years younger than me who's now passing me up. And it's like, it can be that's why people go through a midlife crisis. Yeah, you got to go through a midlife crisis. As you start to realize, like, wait a minute, the future is not blank anymore. A lot of the spaces are already filled in. And, you know, here's my level of success. And I had to realize that, like, look, one reason, you know, I left Accenture, I wanted to go off into and I really loved the city thing. I'd been writing the blog. I started it while I was there, and it really took off, and I was excited about it. I wanted to professionalize it. But also for me to really, you know, I'd kind of reached a maximum point there. You know, I'd done very well in that company. But like, wow, if I wanted to go up, it probably wasn't going to happen. At least not if I would really have to really make some changes and adjustments in that. And so it was kind of time for me to move on. But at some point you kind of did. So Chicago went through its like growth phase, you know, in the like Burnham plan. It's like, boom, we're dreaming big. Chicago, you know, when they made the Burnham plan, they believed Chicago was destined to be the biggest city in the world. And they wanted it to be the greatest city in the world. And things like Build the Art Institute, and they did a bunch of great stuff, right? They didn't even know, like a lot of the businessmen there, they didn't know or care about culture, right? But they knew, let's get it. So, you know, they sent their kids and they just go over to Paris, right? And buy every single famous painting you can put your hands on. But that's basically what a lot of American cities did. You know, New York did that. JP Morgan did that. Go get me this stuff. You know, I just want this stuff. And so they built it. And, you know, now I think Chicago, and then it went kind of down, kind of went into a tailspin, deindustrialization, then it started coming back up. And so now it's in this place. I think the question is, what's your role in the world, right? You know, so that's one that cities have to ask themselves too. And I think when you're in Indianapolis, it's very easy, you know, obviously they still want to grow. They still want to get better. they're a city, in my view, that's still on the way up, right? Their best days are still ahead of it in a lot of ways, but they know they're not going to be London, right? They just know they don't have that pretense that we're going to be the top city. So for a place like Chicago, because they're very close to the top, you know, you're kind of like tantalizingly there. But I don't know that they could really make that transition to take it to the truly, the truly top league of international cities. Now they're still very, 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 very powerful, strong city. So the question is, how do you be the best Chicago that you can be, not like kind of a poor man's imitation London? And so that's where I think, I always say that we have to be the best who we are, not an exquisite replica of somebody else. So that's how I would say. I think Chicago has a lot of assets, great city, great downtown, great location. Unlike a number of places, there are a lot of places that if they didn't exist today, we'd probably never refound them. There would be a big city in Chicago in America, even if we were starting from scratch today. So I think they've got a lot of potential, but they really have a lot of problems they got to work through. And again, I think being that super, super, super top echelon, right, is probably not going to happen for them. So the question is, what can you be? Still be pretty good. You just got to somehow be confident in that. You know, the truth of the matter is the second city syndrome, you might put it, that's part of the identity of that city. So that's just part of what they're going to have to, you're probably going to have to get used to. That's what I would say. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.